Members, this is the appointed time and we have a quorum. Welcome to the first meeting of the panel on housing in 2020. May I wish everybody a happy new year. And then item 1, confirmation of minutes. Members should have received the minutes of the meeting dated the 4th of November 2019, that's CB bracket 1294/1920. The minutes have been forwarded to members. The Secretariat has not received any amendments. Will members please confirm the minutes? Thank you. Item 2, information papers issued since the last meeting. The information papers have been set out on the agenda. Would members please note the information papers? Items for discussion at the next meeting, that's CB bracket 1278/1920 bracket 1 and also CB bracket 1278/1920 bracket 2, list of outstanding items for discussion and list of follow-up actions. The next regular meeting is scheduled on the 3rd of February 2020, Monday at 2:30 p.m. The administration has proposed to discuss 2 public works projects items. The first one is Community Hall, General Outpatient Clinic and Maternal and Child Health Center at Shing Hong Road, Tsing, and the second one is Water Feature Park and Landscaped Walk at Diamond Hill. May I ask if members agree to put these 2 items on the agenda and see if members have other suggestions? Before I allow Mr. Ho Kai-ming to speak, okay, you agree? I'd like to inform members of the following. As members may know, under the panel on housing, we have a subcommittee on inadequate housing conditions. Because of the schedule of the Council, the subcommittee's work has come to an end, but I understand that members are still very concerned about the issue of transitional housing and related matters, and members still have a lot of questions, and members feel that the discussions have not truly reflected all the concerns, and I have exchanged views with the Secretariat. This item will be included in the list of outstanding items for discussion, and then we will talk to the Deputy Chair and see if we can have this item of transitional housing and related matters on the list. And please note the above suggestion, and please allow us together with the Secretariat to discuss the arrangement. Item 4, Long-Term Housing Strategy Annual Progress Report 2019. Please press the button if you want to speak, and we will follow the speaking order as shown on the screen. Meanwhile, let's invite the administration to come in. We have from the administration Mr. Frank Chen, Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Donald Tong, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing, and his team. So, after the administration has completed their presentation, I would urge members to air your views. I understand that members have a lot of questions for the administration. That is why we only have 1 item for today's meeting, so that we can have an ample discussion, because this is an issue close to the heart of members of the public. And I'd also like to report to members that at 4:30, this conference room will be used by another meeting, that is a PWSC. This meeting, therefore, has to be adjourned at 4:25. I regret to say that we're unable to extend the meeting. So please observe the time limit, and then I will decide the speaking time limit after all members who wish to speak have indicated on the screen. So over to you, Frank Chen. Please walk us through the paper. Thank you, Chairman. On the 18th of last month, the government announced published the Annual Progress Report 2019 of the Long-Term Housing Strategy. I will go through the key aspects of the report and also respond to the major comments expressed by the community. As for 2020, 2021, and 2029, 2030, altogether the total housing demand is 425,000, and as such, the total housing supply target will be 430,000. The public-private split of new housing supply will be maintained at 70-30, with the public housing supply target pitched at 300,000 and 1,000 units, and the private target at 129,000 units. For public housing, the supply mix will be maintained at 70-30. That is, in relation to PRH and GSH, the supply target will be 210,000, and the remaining subsidized flats will be 91,000 units. I must emphasize that when the long-term housing strategy was first announced in 2014, we already set out a clear methodology for projecting the rolling 10-year housing supply target. We have been following the established method, making reference to the relevant data available by the, for example, by the government departments, for example, the Census and Statistics Department, and also the Rating and Valuation Department. The methodology and the projections are also set out in the annex of the Annual Progress Report 2019. Comparing to the supply target announced in 2018, there is a downward adjustment of 20,000 because of the reduction in the net increase of households in the 10-year period from 2019 comparing to 2018. The net increase in the number of households are directly taken by the latest domestic household projections. It is envisaged, according to the report, that the net increase in the number of households will continue for the next decades with a tapering off of the trend. This is an open document, a public document, and it is prepared by the CNS department, not just applicable to the long-term housing strategy. Assuming that all statutory procedures are completed smoothly, in the 10 years starting from 2021, the supply target will be 272,000. Comparing to 248,000 units, there will be an increase of 24,000. And the projected shortfall between demand and supply will be reduced from 67,000 to 67,000 by 29,000. As for measures to expedite housing supply through different strategies such as reclamation and new town developments such as Tongshong extension, and also rezoning of existing sites, the projected 10-year housing supply will be increased. Although the demand-supply imbalance has been alleviated, the government will continue to adopt multi-pronged strategies to increase land supply to meet the long-term development needs in different aspects of the community. We will not relax our efforts because of the reduction of the shortfall in the public housing supply projection. We'll continue to expedite land supply and increase overall housing land supply. The Development Bureau will also invoke the Land Resumption Ordinance and implement other strategies such as the land sharing pilot scheme to increase housing land supply. It is expected that the housing land supply will increase, but this is premised on the completion of all statutory procedures and that all sites identified could be developed. And housing production will by and large be completed in the second half of the 10-year period, and that is the latter 5 years. At the moment, a lot of projects are still undergoing consultation, and we still have other procedures to go through, such as site formation and site investigation and funding approval from LegCo. We will make our best effort to compress the construction timetable to meet the housing shortage. As of the end of September 2019, in the past 12 months, the average waiting time for elderly and household applicants are 5.4 years. As of September 2019, we have 149,500 applicants and also 108,000 non-elderly singleton applicants. Public housing production or availability is pitched at 107,000 in the coming 5 years. With a sustained demand for public housing, the average waiting time for public housing in the coming few years will still be under pressure. Well, with the expectation that more public housing units will come on stream in the latter half of the 10-year period, the demand should be alleviated. The government will also introduce transitional housing to improve the living conditions of those inadequately housed households. The chief executive announced in the policy address that transitional housing units will be provided, namely 10,000 in the coming 3 years. The government will also inject $5 billion instead of $2 billion into these projects for construction. With the collaborated effort with the private sector, we have identified sites for 8,000 units. We are confident that in the coming 3 years, we'll be able to complete 10,000 transitional housing units. We must cater for the needs of the public for public housing, whilst at the same time maintain a stream of housing supply in the private sector. Starting from 2020-21, the 10-year private housing supply will continue. The public-private housing mix will be maintained at 70-30. That is, for private housing, the supply target is 129,000. As we did before, we will take into account the latest development and needs of the community to review the mix. There is also a suggestion whether by lowering the private supply mix, it will further exacerbate the supply shortfall. In the coming 3 or 4 years, according to the latest projection, for the first-hand residential unit supply, it is projected to be 93,000 units. The government will continue to stably supply land for private housing and also introduce demand-side management measures as appropriate to curb speculation and curb investment and external demand. On the 19th of June 2019, the government introduced or proposed special rates for vacant first-hand residential flats, and the government also tabled the relevant bill into the council on 23rd of October. We will carefully listen to members' views. Well, as mentioned just now, this meeting will be adjourned at 4:25 because at 4:30 the Public Works Subcommittee meeting will commence. We cannot extend the meeting as such. And for the Long-Term Housing Strategy Annual Progress Report 2019, a lot of members are very concerned, and that is why we only have a single item for today's meeting, so that we have ample time to speak. Well, I've checked the screen, and I urge other members who would like to speak to come down as soon as possible. We have Lau Kwok Fan, Andrew Wan, Deputy Chair, Mr. Kwok Wai Keung, Ms. Eunice Yung, Mr. Koh Kai Ming, Mr. Ray Chen, Dr. Loy Kwok, Mr. Vincent Chan, Dr. Fernando Zhang, myself, and also Mr. Siu Ka Chun. We have 12 members, so I will allow each member to speak for 4 minutes with the first round questions and answers included.
So please make good use of the time. And if you can't get into the first round, then wait for the second round. Mr. Lau. Regarding the LTHS, how exactly are you going to tweak the split between public and private housing? Actually, it's only a mathematical game because at present there simply isn't sufficient resources and the total number has not been changed significantly. And if you want to further increase it, either you have to resume lands or land sharing or reclamation. And the government has said in the past that it is going to redouble its efforts to resume lands. And so my question for the Housing Bureau is this. Even though the Development Bureau is also involved, if you only tweak the target for public and private housing mix and do not support it with adequate supply of lands, you are never going to reach your target. And so my question is, how many more lands are you going to resume through the Land Resumption Ordinance? I thank Mr. Lau for his question. With regard to resuming private lands, actually, we have done a lot of work. The Development Bureau has done a lot of groundwork already. And in a paper, we have already given an account. In the coming 5 years, it is projected that we'll be able to resume 400 hectares of private lots. And if you compare this with the situation before, actually, in the past 5 years, we have only managed to resume 20 hectares. And so if we have community support and also the support of this council, it is our hope that we'll be able to boost land supply through resuming more private lands so that we can deliver more lands for private and public housing projects. So in the coming 5 years, 400 hectares will be resumed, according to you. Is it only a paper projection or is it a very concrete target? I understand that this is a very sensitive information, but I just want to know whether this is already a concrete target or is it simply a paper projection? Mr. Chen, my team has already delivered this figure. I'm sure they have their reasons for delivering it. I'm deferring the question to Madam Ho. Secretary Ho, concerning the resumption of 4 hectares of private lands, actually this projection is based on concrete projects. And a lot of them will come from Kutong and Fanling North. Because we have phase 1 development there. And 68 hectares actually have already been resumed, and these are all private lands. And then we have another concrete project in the form of Hong Shui Kyu. And then after rezoning is completed, we have Yuen Long South. And also individual sites will be used for public housing. For instance, Canteen South. Actually, we have heard about this many, many times, and we have discussed them. So these known lots will be resumed through new town development. Because now you are merely catching up on lost ground. I just want to know whether there are new lots that will be resumed through Land Resumption Ordinance. Because Kutong and Fanling North and Hong Shui Kyu, actually they have all been known lots and they have all been factored into previous calculation. But the CE seems to have suggested that there will be resumption of new lots, and I'd like to know whether there will be new lots that will be resumed under the LRO. Indeed, there will be. In last year's policy address, we have outlined several initiatives. If a particular land parcel has been inspected by our colleagues and the land parcel is suitable for public housing, then there is indeed a possibility that we can resume it for public housing. And some of these candidate sites are brownfield sites. And last year's policy address mentions the brownfield sites. And under this, actually 160 hectares of brownfield sites with good potential will be inspected. And actually, work on this is progressing very smoothly. And it is our hope that in due course we'll be able to give you a report. Mr. Wan, I'm really shocked that the government is revising downward the target for LTHS for the coming decade. I think this is really beyond our cognition. And of course, having a long-term housing strategy is a very good thing, but I have never seen a government on day one already came out to say that it will never be able to deliver on its strategy and its target. Now, there is an imbalance between supply and demand. According to Census and Statistics Department, according to you, there will be a reduction in the number of core households. I just want to know what is your justification for this. Do you have any figures on private flat supply and also affordability of these households with regard to those flats that enable you to come to the conclusion that these core families will not be needing public housing flats anymore? So the Census and Statistics Department concludes that there will be a smaller demand, and yet the smaller demand actually is dictated by the smaller supply. And so this is kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. And if you build fewer and fewer flats, are you going to also say that there will be fewer and fewer demand? This will be a joke. At present, 270,000 people have already put in application for public housing, and so these are all known cases. I'd like to know whether these cases are realistic demand and known demand. Now, why is it that you have neglected and ignored these figures and proceeded to revise downward the long-term housing strategy 10-year target? And secondly, about transitional housing. Now, even though you may have agreement for phase 2 development of DC land, and so I just want to know whether there is room for you to negotiate with DC land so that the phase 2 lot already reserved can actually be surrendered for transitional housing. Now, even if you manage to deliver 10,000 transitional housing, I'm sure you also know that over 200,000 people actually are living in substandard housing. And so even if you were able to deliver 10,000 transitional flats, which is already an if, I still would not applaud you. I understand that there is some realistic issues here, but still I would like to urge you to talk to the Economic Services Bureau, Bureau Secretary Mr. Yao, and talk also to Disneyland Resort Corporation to see whether phase 2 land can be used for transitional housing. Indeed, phase 2 of Disney land development will be dependent upon the provision of lands for phase 2. And in order to govern that, there is an agreement signed between the government and Disneyland Resort. And the joint venture company between the two parties actually has the first option of purchasing the land. Indeed, there is a possibility that other uses can be found for the land. Unfortunately, there is a proviso that says that the land cannot be used for residential purpose. And of course, we would want the Disneyland Resort Company to consider its obligation towards corporate social responsibility and would be willing to let us out of that forbidding proviso. But that is going to be time-consuming. And Mr. Wen also mentions the households that are on the waiting list. Indeed, general applicants together with one person, an elderly person households, 170,000, and non-elderly households on the application list, 110,000 cases, and so together the number is quite large. But non-elderly applicants only will have a 50% success rate. And so the demand actually is not dictated by the number of households on the waiting list, but the net increase in the number of households in Hong Kong. For instance, marriage cases and also divorce cases, and also the number of households that are in substandard living conditions. And indeed, the starting point is a little bit different. Chairman, actually, I do not agree. So this is a self-fulfilling fallacy. So you are saying that you fail to deliver on the target, and that as a result, people that are aspiring to such supply of housing will also become smaller. And I'm sure if you allow the waiting time to be extended to 6 or 7 years, then actually people will have even less aspiration for public housing. Because there is already social mobility in the community, and people sometimes may see their wage increases. And because some of the cases have exceeded the income limit by several dollars, then they are already out of the net. And as a result, they fall out of the application range.
Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Thank you, Chairman. The government adheres to a formula and prepares a projection on a regular basis. Well, some of our members may query the accuracy of the projections and criticize the projections for not adhering to the reality. But in fact, the whole exercise is quite pointless. It's just going through the motions. So is it really important that you have a lower range projection, or is it more important to see if the target has been met? From 2015 to 2019, if we look at the figures, we should provide 110,000 public housing units, but the actual completion was just 70,000. We have a shortfall of 40,000. It's not just about the shortfall of 20,000 in your projections. We're talking about actual supply in the past 4 years. There's a shortfall of 40,000, and there is no prospect of catching up with the shortfall. So when are you going to catch up and give us back to 40,000 units that we're currently short of? It is just like an IOU note prepared by the government. Now, how about I just make partial repayment instead of paying for the whole of the debt? How about saving it for later? Well, I actually have submitted 3 motions. I need to make my stance clear. First of all, I don't care how, but you need to find ways to provide housing, whether it's a golf course or it's the second phase of Disneyland. You need to have spade-ready site available for housing production. And for brownfield sites and redevelopment sites, well, nothing works better than reclamation, so don't get in the way. Secretary, you need to tell people that, or you won't be able to repay the debt. And you didn't even want to mention the shortage of 40,000 units at the moment. We are worried that the debt will just pile up. You should pay up as soon as possible because, as we all know, much of the grievances in the community lies with housing shortage. So we sincerely want it to be resolved. Well, some politicians here may not want it to be resolved because they want the community to be more aggrieved so that something big would happen. So please work harder, Secretary. Well, I believe everything is clearly set out in the annual progress report. Please be reassured. We also understand that the actual production doesn't meet the supply target fully. That's for a particular year, that's true. But in terms of our projection exercise and a rolling 10-year housing supply target, the figures would be made up. Well, for example, in the previous years as well as this year, we have seen an increase in the number of inadequately housing conditions. And that is why this year we had 39,000 such IHH households. It's not the case of not honoring our promise. I understand that you have been understanding as well. And for many years, we have failed to meet the public housing production target, mainly because we were just trying to catch up with the previous lags. And it's difficult to find sites for housing production. In fact, we have doubled up our effort and expedite our work. We expect the housing production to increase, and that is why we're able to identify sites for 272,000 units, whereas for previous years we were only able to identify sites for 107,000 units. Much of the figures will come on stream in the second half of the 10-year period. Ms. Eunice Yong. Chairman, I question the methodology of the supply targets. Every day we hear in the news that housing demand is getting more and more keen, but the figure seems to have decreased. For example, net increase in number of households plus households displaced by redevelopment plus inadequately housed households plus miscellaneous factors. You have A, B, C, D adding together. And you see a net increase in number of households going down from some 228,000 some years ago to 209,000. That's dropped by 1/4 in terms of the net increase. We have more and more households, in fact, starting from 2014 to 2019. For IHH, also an increase by of 12%. Of course, we need to do our own research. The government will not provide these figures to us. I just want to know why the total target has dropped. Well, in fact, the demand has decreased. If we only look at the figures, but it seems that the government is pulling wool over our eyes. And that is not true. Whether you talk about the public-private mix 70-30 or 60-40, whether we have increase in the housing supply, the true picture is that the housing demand is on the decline. Can you please explain that, Secretary? And then the total housing supply target also correspondingly drops. In 2014, it was 482,000. Now, the total housing supply target is only 425,000. Because of lower demand, the supply target is also lower. Does it mean that 10 years down the road, we should expect to have zero demand or zero supply? Because you're doing nothing but manipulating figures. You compare figures with those in 2016. Then perhaps you should suppress the figures in 2016 so that the numbers continue to drop. So I have a feeling that these figures are being manipulated. I think this is not a true picture that housing demand is on the decline. Right, is that true, Secretary? Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Eunice Yong, for giving us a chance to explain. For the 10-year supply target, we're talking about the target on a rolling basis. That is, in the coming decade, we do project an increase in population, but then it's tapering off. For example, let me give you an example. Say we have a 50,000 net increase in number of households, then in the coming decade, there will be 500,000. Let's say if the net increase is tapering off, instead of 50,000, we have 20,000 more households per year, then in the coming decade, the total number will, of course, drop. It's not about manipulating figures. It's about the net increase in the number of households and the downward trend of increase. In the past, when we had the housing shortage, we could not meet the target. But when the net increase in population was not as severe, as we project the rolling target, 10-year target, we also consider the need for public housing as well as private housing. So I urge members to understand this point, and if need be, we can invite the relevant government departments to give you a clearer account. Well, no matter how the target is or isn't met, I don't know, because say every year we do not have 30,000 units of public housing coming on stream at least. I don't really know the use of long-term housing strategy if the targets are not met. Mr. Ho Kai-ming. Thank you, Chairman. No offense, Secretary. But if you talk about a rolling target, I would say that you should just beat it, because indeed, according to the population projections, in 2016 the projection was 7.43 million, but then in 2019 is 8.2 million. We have 247,000 applicants lining up. How can you say that 10 years down the road there will be a decline in housing demand? Secretary, I don't know whether you played some tricks to manipulate the figures. I still can't figure out why, despite the increase in the population, you have fewer demand for housing, less demand for housing. And also for aged public housing stock, 26 public housing estates will be more than 50 years old. According to the paper, some 10% of these aged estates require redevelopment. And in fact, the quality of other public housing estates is such that they may not last as long. And there is only one estate at the moment set aside for redevelopment. That's Wafu Estate. Have you conducted any assessment, such as Choi Hong Estate, Warlock Estate, whether they will be redeveloped? We've heard nothing so far. Secretary, can you explain? When you talk about a rolling population projection, can you explain how come the demand will drop despite increase in population? Perhaps I didn't explain myself clearly. I will invite the Permanent Secretary to explain to you. Make it more comprehensible, please. We're not talking about the total demand, but the rate of increase of demand. As another member just now mentioned, the number of households have dropped, but that's not true. That's a drop in the net increase in the number of households. Well, that means the queue is still getting longer, but not at the same rate of increase. So the demand is still on the rise, that's true, despite a tapering growth. And in his opening remarks, Secretary already mentioned that these figures are prepared on the basis of the CNSD's data. And that's about the latest domestic household projections. The projections are not based on the 2016 figures, but the projections from 2016 to 2025. In fact, according to their data, the figure would increase from 2015-16, and then the curve would taper off without such a drastic increase. So in other words, the housing production is still not catching up. Yes, that's the methodology used for preparing projections.
Redevelopment? I think Mr. Ho knows this very well. At the Housing Authority, with regard to older housing estates, we do an annual review and annual assessment, and on the basis of such an assessment, we'll come to a decision as to whether or not to redevelop a certain estate. If you look at 2015 to 2016 to 2019 and 20, the public housing construction volume is increasing every year. And this is mainly because of the changes in land supply. Mr. Chen? Just now I heard that from the Federation of Trade Unions that some of the lawmakers do not want the government to solve the housing problem so that there'll be more social grievances and there'll be more social unrest. I think this is a very, very absurd observation. I think we, sitting on the housing panel, every one of us actually would want the housing problem to be solved. And indeed, there are a lot of social grievances in the community with regard to housing. And there is a headline from a major newspaper saying that the Lantau reclamation plan actually is a waste of money, and at the same time there are vacant government lots that are lying around idle, not being used. And the Disneyland 60 hectares land are now being idled, and also brownfield sites are now being idled, and also the Taipo industrial estate vacant lots have been lying idled for over 20 years. And so I think this particular newspaper has launched this headline in order to tie in with today's housing panel's discussion. I hope that the secretary can respond to all these, because all along you've been saying that you would want to identify more lots, you and the Development Bureau. But if you also give the community the impression that actually there are available lands, but at the same time you're not making good use of them, and you are allowing them to lay vacant or idle, of course there will be social grievances. I've got a proposal. Actually, this has been a proposal that has been around for many, many years. Is it possible for us to make flexible use of garrison lots? Now, recently, Mr. Shak Lai Him has also floated this proposal. The PLA generals are saying that if Hong Kong is in trouble, then the garrison will arrive on the scene within 10 minutes. And so, actually, that is more efficient than the police's performance at the August 21st incident. So we don't necessarily need to resume those garrison sites. But for the sake of harmony, is it possible for us to borrow such sites from the garrison for development of housing? Now, it seems that this has been a taboo subject before, because if anyone dared to mention it, that would be an affront on the military. But now I think we can introduce more flexibility. Is it possible for you to simply ask them whether or not this is flexible? Simply put a question to them. Our target is to, as soon as possible, identify suitable sites. And our paper already says that in terms of resuming private lands in the coming 5 years, our hope is that we'll be able to resume 400 hectares. And at present, we are now examining 450 known sites, and 160 of them are closer to existing infrastructure. And such a review will be completed by the end of 2019, and also technical feasibility will be launched. And also we are looking at the number of private lots, and we'll come to a conclusion in the middle of 2020. And recently, in the 3 urban squatter areas, including Aochiwan and Chao Kuo Leng, we'll be looking at the flexibility of using those sites. And so in terms of rezoning, in terms of developing suitable lands for housing, we believe that there will be sufficient supply for us to support private and public housing. As for the use of garrison sites, I think the government has already made known its stance very clearly some time ago. Mr. Low Kwok? 5 years ago, when the long-term housing strategy was first launched, the total target for long-term housing strategy for a 10-year period was 480,000. But the government has made it very clear that this will be a rolling projection based on the CNSD department's assessment of increase in number of households, and also economic indicators, and so on and so forth. So this is subject to adjustment every year. So this is a rolling figure. So the 10-year figure actually can be tweaked from 1 year to another. And the government has already given an explanation on this. And so I don't think we should allow ourselves to fixate on whether the government is trying to trick us with differential figures, because the government figures are well substantiated by various justifications. And the number of households is already taken into consideration, and so has been the rate of increase. Now, it seems that with the slowing in the rate of increase, the situation is a little bit better, but still the government fails to meet the target. For instance, for public housing, it's only 90% at this point in time. In other words, 10% of the construction still is not accounted for. And so in order to make up for that 10%, you can only pin your hope on the future. The recent figures have all been on the low side, and so we can only pin our hope on the future, playing catch up, and so on and so forth. Of course, everybody serving on the Housing Authority is a voluntary worker. And we at the Housing Authority see that in recent months, the shortfall has been quite serious. And towards the latter part of the 10 years, the government said that it's going to play catch up. But that may not actually materialize, because even this year, there is a 10% shortfall that is not yet accounted for. Now, as for the construction that has been accounted for, it is supported by availability of new lands. For instance, from reclamation in Tung Chung New Town and Fanling North, new development areas, and NT North, new development areas. But as these are all new development projects, a lot of infrastructure will have to be provided first. And for Kutong North, the Housing Authority has already voted funding for Phase 1 development, and so that is very lucky, and such works are already ongoing. But still, there will be a certain period of lead time before the lands are actually available and suitable for building housing. And so, let alone the construction that has not been accounted for, even the construction figures that have been accounted for, that already have available lands to support them, how sure are you that they can be delivered on time, the housing? According to the progress report released by the end of 2019, which is based on our recent review of the situation, as I said earlier on, the process is going to be challenging and there will be difficulties. But the existing government is working very, very hard. And I'm quite confident that site formation and site provision can be completed in time. Of course, that will be dependent on Legislative Council supports, District Council supports, and also funding support from this council, and so on and so forth. And so these are factors that we're dependent on. Mr. Vincent Chan. So the progress report, the latest one, says that we are still falling behind, and the public housing construction target is being revised downward. Of course, we would not want to play catch-up all the time, as my colleagues have already pointed out. Starting from paragraphs 11 to 42, the paper tells us around 30 tricks that the government will pull out of its sleeves in order to boost production and also catch up to lost ground. And so we hope that each of these tricks can be really worked to its full, so that you can deliver more, so that you can catch up even more lost ground. Now, about the transitional housing program, which is the threshold of public housing program, as you have pointed out, there are over 100,000 or even 120,000 households that are in inadequate housing. Of course, I know that the Secretary has worked very, very hard in order to deliver 10,000 transitional housing units in 3 years. Maybe you are able to deliver only 8,000 actually. But still, there is still a lot of room for you to further improve the program and also to expand this program. Now, it seems that at this point in time, you are relying on the charity of private developers to donate or to loan you lands in order to provide transitional housing. And there are very, very few lands that are actually coming out of the public land sale program or from the government's pocket. I believe that this is an appropriate representation of the housing ladder. If the transitional housing program can be made more successful, I'm sure more grassroots households can be helped. So even if you were able to provide 10,000 transitional housing units, still around 100,000 units are still households are still in inadequate housing. And so in order to help those, is it possible for you? Is it possible for you to provide a rental assistance for them? Understand that for transitional housing, many councillors are very supportive, and I have received help from you. And I believe that this program will go on smoothly. And starting from 2017, we have launched the program of community housing sharing program. And now, several years down the road, we've got 5 full-time workers on the Transitional Housing Committee, including 2 directors. And in this year's budget, we are going to apply for funding to increase staff resources by the margin of 10 heads. And one of them will be a staff grade C administrative officer. And he is going to oversee the program. And we hope that you give us a favorable consideration when we come to you in due course for funding at the Finance Committee. And once the funding is in place, they will be able to go ahead full speed. And the government is urged to take a more proactive stand, and we indeed are already moving towards that directions. And there are already 5 full-time workers, and there will be an enlargement of the staff complement, and many of them are actually from Housing Department. And so this is our efforts in order to boost the transitional housing program. And also, in the near term, we hope that we'll be able to find either public or private lots that are being idle at this point in time. So you are incorporating transitional housing policy in the long-term housing, or are you going to incorporate the transitional housing policy into the long-term housing strategy in order to show your commitment? Indeed, we're going to work very, very hard on it. In order to solve housing problem permanently, we need to provide permanent housing. Transitional housing is only for transitional purpose. We believe that if we provide enough permanent housing, the need for transitional housing will disappear. And so that is the spirit against which we're going to work the transitional housing program. And indeed, we really need to think about whether or not to incorporate transitional housing policy into long-term housing strategy. Mr. Fernando Zhang. Now, for the underprivileged families, and for the families that are really in need of institutional care, the provision of housing for these households has never met the target, has never or has always been behind. Now, even your targets, you are not able to meet. So this is very worrying. And you say that the figures are rolling figures, and it seems that you are never able to catch up. Now, even if we were to use your own targets, in the coming 10 years, your private housing supplied target is 29,000. However, in the coming 3 to 4 years, you say that private housing supply is going to be 93,000 flats. So that already accounts for a very large part of the total number of 129,000. So your private housing target is not being met. Actually, there are already available lands for you to develop private housing, but still, public housing is falling behind. In the coming 3 to 4 years, since a lion's share of the total number of 129,000 private flats will already have been provided, is it possible for you to provide more lands out of the land sale program for public housing? So is it possible for you to reallocate some of the lands that you have earmarked for sale to private developers to public housing construction program? Is it possible for you to allocate even more lands to public housing?
多謝。
Secretary. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Zhang, for your comments. Well, our public-private mix used to be 60-40. In light of the grassroots housing needs, the government has adjusted the mix from 60-40 to 70-30. And Dr. Zhang made a very valid point. It's true that in the coming few years we have 93,000 units of public housing coming on stream. But we need to ensure a healthy development of the private property sector as well without bringing too much impact on the market. We also need to take into account the keen demand for housing in the private sector. So if we have healthy development in the market, we will not rule out a future review of the 70-30 public-private mix in the future. And in preparing the annual report, we also take into consideration the public housing supply target, whether we can meet the grassroots needs. We understand at the moment this is not met, but this has to be considered in the light of healthy development in the private property market. I hope you further adjust the mix to, say, 80-20 or 90-10. If for private housing targets you are already meeting the target. As for the GSH, it's not clear. You have 70-30, you have PRH versus GSH at 70-30, and other subsidized sale flats as remaining. But say for GSH, if it is rolled out in the market, the units have to be refurbished, and Mr. Stanley Wong also admitted that at least 100 days will be required, and this will cause delay for PRH successful applicants to be given an offer. Can you can you tell us what the proportion of GSX should be? Well, thank you for the follow-up question. Basically, for the GSH, is totally convertible with PRH. We need to learn from history. For those who would like to acquire housing units, we can tweak the GSH supply. In 2004, I believe we all learned from the Hong Kong development lesson. We could convert the units 100% from sale to rental units. We need to preserve this flexibility. Well, we have received altogether 5 motions moved without notice and one amended motion. And if you have other motions, please submit them as soon as possible. We need time to deal with that. And I also like to remind other members of the housing panel in this complex, if you want to speak, please come down and press a button. I need to draw a line very soon, because at 4:25 or 4:30 we need to pass the room to PwC for their meeting. All right, it's my turn. Secretary, as you know, the public's view of the housing strategy in Hong Kong is such that the long-term housing strategy report is an important indicator. The public would rely on the long-term housing strategy report as the bellwether. Regrettably, the supply target will be reduced by 20,000 in this report. That is 430,000 units in the coming 10 years. I am disappointed because, after all, we're in dire straits. The deepest conflict in the community at the moment is, after all, housing. I believe that if this problem can be resolved, we would have peace right now. And anyway, I'd like the Secretary to respond to a number of points. First, about land development arrangements. I'm all for substantial developments. We do not want infill sites. We do not want standalone buildings. We do not want piecemeal development in urban areas, because we all know that these developments are costly and it also takes a long time. The pencil-like infill buildings also have a strong impact on the community. You need to have support from the community. But now we understand the district council's situation. Is it really difficult to conduct local consultation, as you put it? Is there any way to make the whole exercise smoother? And in any case, we want large-scale development. We don't want standalone and infill buildings. Second point, I'm aggrieved by the government's handling of housing matters, and that is the administrative aspect is taking too long, from earmarking a site to planning studies to securing funding approval to tendering exercise to the actual completion. It takes 3, 5, or so, even 7 years. So, Secretary, you said the government is determined to resolve housing shortage. Are there any ways that you can make sure that those behind you, the government departments, can give you the full support and expedite your work? We don't want talk shop. Do you have specific measures to tell us you will expedite the administrative procedures? Third point, Secretary, you mentioned about transitional housing. At the moment, it's not opportune to see if transitional housing should be added to our housing ladder. Honestly, Secretary, I'd like to tell you that transitional housing may be the solution, but if we no longer need transitional housing, it means that all the demands have been met. So perhaps transitional housing should be another rung on the housing ladder to cater for the needs of this group of people. 3 points, Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, you just now mentioned future housing development, and basically we share the same view. We need community space, residential care homes, etc., to form the community. Let me take this question on transitional housing as another rung on the housing ladder. I have no strong views on the matter. Transitional housing basically is a rung on the housing ladder. But whether this is a long-term housing objective is something that we need to mull over. And there is no difference in terms of construction cost and timetable for public and private housing. And perhaps Deputy Secretary Ho can respond to your other questions. Thank you for your questions. Regarding procedures, statutory procedures including rezoning and a gazettal of works relating to roads and infrastructure, they are mandatory procedures. According to the recent policy address, the government has proposed to strive for more brownfield sites for housing development. Well, the department conducted an internal review and agreed that we could expedite some of the procedures so that these two steps can go in parallel. So if we can identify a suitable brownfield site for public housing development, we hope to compress the timetable. And we've also set a target for ourselves, from studies to infrastructure to site formation to passing over the site to housing authority for development. It usually takes 7 to 8 years. We hope to compress the timetable to 5 or 6 years. I hope we can achieve that. Mr. Xu Ka-chen, the title of this paper is Annual Progress Report 2019 of the Long-Term Housing Strategy. I don't understand what progress we've made after reading the paper. I think we've been stagnant. I don't even think we're catching up at all. About paragraph 13 of the annex of the paper, It refers to households living in non-residential buildings, that is, in industrial buildings, etc. According to the estimated number stood at 5,600. That's the same as in 2016. Without appropriate enforcement action, it means that the households are moving from one industrial building to another. They are still not adequately housed. They are evicted or forced to move to another industrial building, and the problem remains. I want to know, in the light of this phenomenon, what will be done? And also paragraph 15 on page 5 of the Chinese version, there is another number about households living in units made up of temporary structures. In 2017, the figure was 20,400. Now it has risen to 21,200. So more and more households are living in temporary structure. What support is the government giving to them? And about the moving subsidy provided under the Community Care Fund, those affected by the building department's work will be eligible, as well as those living in SDUs. Now, will the government consider providing subsidy for those in this category as well? And I'd like to refer to transitional housing in this paper. In the past few months, some major developers announced lending sites to the government for transitional housing construction with a time limit. There is a question on whether the developers will stand to benefit because the government will need to speed up the infrastructure works in the area so that they will eventually get approval from the town planning board as soon as possible, and that they could make use of the scheme to build residential or to rezone agricultural sites into residential sites. And what is the Secretary's response to this criticism? And Mr. Ray Chen just now asked a question, and I'd like to pick up on that. According to today's newspaper, the government is a big waster because the government has always said that there is no land available. Now, for the 60 hectares of vacant site in Penny's Bay, it is idle at the moment. What is your response? Well, as I have already responded about the Penny's Bay site, the government has a joint venture with Disneyland, and that site has been earmarked for future expansion of Disneyland, and that is the site in question. There is a restrictive covenant applicable to the site such that it cannot be used for residential purpose. Disneyland Company is required to, cannot therefore fulfill its responsibility and provide transitional housing because of the restrictive covenant. As for those living on rooftops and temporary structures, for these non-PRH tenants under the CCF, we provide cash subsidy, and we'll also conduct a review on regularizing this scheme. And next point, I'd like to reassure members, because a Section 16 application is required for using the site to build transitional housing units. And after the scheme is completed, if the site is to be used for other purposes, another town planning board application will be required. Next, Mr. Michael Tan is not in the seat. Next, Mr. Eddie Chu. Thank you, Chairman. On transitional housing, it is quite apparent why major developers are willing to donate sites. And there is a timestamp because of the fear of the government's taking back the sites for public housing. Now, with a tenure of 7 or 10 years, they provide transitional housing, and in return, the government cannot invoke the Land Resumption Ordinance for public housing development. I think it's very clear.
Whether or not the government admits to that, the Council has already made it very clear that it wants the government to do this. If transitional housing is to be provided to solve urgent housing needs, then the government should put up the resources out of its own pocket instead of using under-table agreement between the government and the developers. If the government is really serious about providing transitional housing, then the government should use government lands to do it. And the second point actually has to do with Mr. Fernando Cheung's point. I have noticed that during the past 2 years, when the government has adjusted the private-public housing split from 4 to 6 to 3 to 7, the target has dropped precipitously from 180,000 to 130,000 for private housing. And the government comes up with a footnote every year that in the coming 3 to 4 years, it's the government's estimate that the supply of private housing will be to the tune of 93,000 flats. So that naturally will give people the impression that if within 3 to 4 years you already are able to provide 93,000 private flats, then it should be very easy for you to meet the total target of 129,000 private flats. If you are able to meet a private housing target early, then the lands originally earmarked for private housing could then be reallocated for public housing. So that should be the logical deduction. Yet, it seems that the government is painting a picture whereby every year the private housing target is actually more easily within reach, and at the same time, the government still has to play catch-up permanently on public housing construction target. Now, say for NT-North developments such as NT-Northwest, even after the sites have been formed and all infrastructure has been in place, you may still withhold certain sites for sale because the private housing target is already met, and you still might refuse to surrender those sites for public housing. Is that a possibility? Now, first of all, I have to say that even for private developers to lend us sites for development of transitional housing, it doesn't mean that they do not have any other consideration. It's only that the lands are being borrowed in order to meet urgent public housing or other housing needs. Now, if the government actually has lands available, then we, of course, will give priority to building public housing. And if there are lands that are being idle, we'll also try to use them as soon as possible. As for review over private market, every year when we do the progress report, we will also review the private housing market development. And there is always the possibility that in time, there may be further adjustment to the mix between public and private housing. Mr. James Tian? I beg your pardon, Michael Tian. The first-hand flats vacancy bill actually has passed through first reading last October. I do not have any objection towards that. But I do believe that the first-hand vacancy tax will only be effective if it is supported by a second-hand vacancy tax. And many landlords at present are willing to allow their second-hand flats to go vacant without renting them out if the rental target of theirs are not met. Even though the present vacancy rate is set to be 2 to 3%, which does not warrant any major efforts, I actually dispute this. Actually, according to a figure in 2016, the private flats number 1.55 million. However, in 2019, private flats that have occupiers numbered 1.34 million. And so if you subtract 1.55 million by 1.34 million, it would mean that vacant private flats would actually be 13.5% of the total number instead of 3.9%. And so there is a big difference between the two. In March, the Secretary obviously is looking at something, and so I'll give him some time. In March, you gave us a briefing on first-hand flats vacancy tax, and the government is saying that for 3 years old flats, you will charge 3%, and you will try to ascertain whether a flat is vacant by making inquiries with property management and so on and so forth, to see whether people actually are airing their laundry in order to determine whether a flat is vacant. And also that would exclude the over 100,000 village housing units in the new territories. And so it seems that you are simply plucking a figure out of thin air. You are not basing this on any substantial justification. Actually, I've been asked this question many times. They all want to know exactly how many private flats are vacant. And so, Secretary, is it possible for you to undertake to look into this? Now, after you learned of the truth, whether or not you're going to proceed with any substantial initiatives or policy measures, that's another matter. I don't think you should stop at charging first-hand flats vacancy tax, because if private vacant flats actually are 13.5% of the total number of private flats, that's a huge percentage. According to the figures that I have, in 2018, 2.8% of total private flats are vacant. So it's not even 3.9%, it's now 2.8%. In any case, I've heard Mr. Michael Tian. I'm going to refer his opinion to R&VD, because all of these figures actually have to pass through verification process. Secretary, I hope that you undertake to come up with an accurate method in order to ascertain how many private vacant flats there are. I think this definitely is going to be a good thing. It cannot be bad. Okay, I'll talk to the R&VD. We've got Abraham Shack, Mr. Chan Hoi, Madam Chan Hoi-yan, and Mr. Chen Han-pen, and Mr. Jeremy Tam in the first round. And then there'll be other speakers in the second round, because we have to hand over the venue by 4:25, and so I have to draw a line here. Anyone else would like to speak? If not, I'm going to draw a line here, because we still need some time to process 6 motions. Mr. Abraham Shack. Secretary, in 2019, I've criticized you a lot. And I've also searched my soul to see whether during the past 19 years I have used overly harsh words on you. And my conclusion is yes, because of the many secretaries that have filled this post. I believe that you are one of the hardest working and also most committed one. And many politicians on this panel are actually going after votes only. And you are the Secretary for Housing. Of course, I'm representing the real estate development sector. But whether or not the issue is being resolved is really not whether or not there is a first-hand or second-hand property vacancy tax. It is really all down to the government's policy. And where does such a policy come from? I think your direction, especially the approach of the Carrie Lam's administration, is wrong. Now, during the colonial era, the government then would tailor government policies towards the housing needs of the community at the time. If they need temporary housing, then temporary housing would be provided. If they need public housing, public housing would be provided. But now it seems that you are focusing on enabling people to own their own homes. I don't think that is the right target. At present, if 90% of the flats are being subsidized by the government, that is very dangerous, because people who should not have bought a flat or property would then be seduced into buying one. And I really don't want to see any more negative assets cases appearing in Hong Kong. I think the vacancy tax really is superfluous. I think you should try to pull your socks up instead and come up with more concrete and more meaningful housing policies. For instance, GSH and also SSH sites actually could be reallocated for building more public housing. Now, the private developers, of course, are lending some sites to you, but that is meaningless. I think you should instead use those sites for building more care and attention homes. Secretary, 5,000 to 6,000 elderly persons that have moved into care and attention, or that are waiting to move into care and attention homes, actually have passed away before being allocated a place. And the PSA report actually has already pointed this out. And so you don't need to interfere with the market so much. Let's not think about a land tower reclamation as yet, because it is about the future. And let's do things that can be done at this point in time. For instance, allocating lands from country parks and rezoning, and the temporary housing idea really is quite meaningless. You are an engineer. I can see that you are really working very, very hard to want to make this problem go away. But please do not try to encourage people to purchase homes anymore. Hong Kong's problem is not because people have not enough flats to purchase. It's only that the system is not transparent enough, and it's not just enough for people to fairly and justly be provided with housing that they need. Okay, Secretary, would you please take note of Mr. Shek's opinion? Next, Mr. Chen Ho-yan. Madam Chen Ho-yan, sorry. Starting from 2014, the government has been doing LTHS projections, and so it's now into your 5th year. And you have explained that you have made use of a lot of figures to do your calculation, and now your total supply target is now being reduced. And you are saying that this is merely a figure, and you have to face up to the reality that Hong Kong's housing problem is worsening. You and I and everyone in Hong Kong actually know this very well. And now you say that the total housing supply target will be reduced, and the total demand for housing actually is being reduced. And so that is really not in line with the reality that we observed. I hope that you have an open mind, and you always say that you have an open mind, and you ask us to give you suggestions. We have given you a lot of suggestions, but you do not listen to them, and you have failed to even take them back for consideration. Now, what is very obvious that across political parties in the government, in the council, we have already floated the proposal of rental control for partitioned flats. Now, have you heard this once again? I hope that you can go back and think about this once again. I understand that in the past, Hong Kong had, at a point in time, had rental control program, but it did not work very, very well. But now, the reality on the ground is that partition flats actually carried even higher rental than regular flats, and many people are living in inadequate housing. Now, please don't say that this is not going to be workable, because it has been done in the past and it has not worked, please go back and take a fresh look at this again. Now, we want to help those who are living in partition flats, and at the same time, we want to provide electricity and water charges assistance and subsidies to these households because and this cannot be done because these households do not have individual electricity and water meters. And thirdly, transitional housing. So by its name, we know that it is for transitional purpose and it is only for short term. We want that to become one of the rungs of housing ladder. And we have said many times that if you want to build such a transitional housing, you should not entrust it to NGOs because NGOs should belong in a social welfare sector. And so they should remain in social welfare sector, not in the housing sector. And so the government should instead come up with land resources and build its own transitional housing instead of entrusting it to NGOs. And also for redevelopment, in the coming 10 years, 26 PRH estates, 20 belonging to HA and 6 belonging to HS will reach the age of 50. You don't need a crystal ball for that because you already know this. And which of these public housing estates will have reached the age of 50? You know very, very well. And so what are you waiting for? Why can't you give people the hope? We are talking about 688,000 units here. After redevelopment, after you adjust the plot ratio, after you build higher blocks, you can actually accommodate more households. So why can't you give us a concrete timetable for redevelopment? Not even in the long-term housing strategy.
Secretary, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chen. Basically, I agree that the crux of Hong Kong's problem is housing. But because of shortage in the housing land supply, we are barely able to catch up. And we are also working on a number of fronts, such as the IHH, inadequately housed households. Under the Labour and Welfare Bureau, we have cash subsidy, and we also have a study to regularize this subsidy. And the Labour and Welfare Bureau has already undertaken that this study will be completed by the end of 2020. About the housing ladder, transitional housing can provide another rung on the housing ladder because of shortage of supply. We have no strong views on the matter. Now we already have 5 housing department colleagues, including a project director, striving for resources. And subject to LegCo's funding proposal, there will be 10 more posts, including 1 AOSGC and 10 colleagues to help expedite work. Housing Authority, Housing Society, other professional bodies, institutes may provide help on project design. Well, in the interest of time, please speed up. Well, we have a comprehensive assessment on redevelopment. We have 270,000 PRH applicants, and once new PRH estates come on stream, we need to decide whether they should be used to accommodate new applicants or to rehouse existing applicants. Well, rent control for subdivided units, it has nothing to do with Labour and Welfare Bureau. I think he's heard you, Mr. Ban Chen. Today we're discussing the Long-Term Housing Strategy Annual Progress Report. Well, ever since Frank Chan has assumed office, we have never seen the target being met, and we are talking about a lower target. Well, in 2019, we went to the Che Kung Temple in Sha Tin, and there was a fortune reading. Let me read it out. That is, even if you thought that resources would be available, it's not true. Well, that's exactly what we're experiencing. We're only drawing a pie to quench our hunger. The average waiting time used to be 3.9 years for PRH applicants. Now, the waiting time is 5.4 years. So, Secretary, every year you're lagging behind the target whilst the PRH application queue is getting longer. It's just a drop in the ocean. How are you going to shorten the queue? And today you've told us that according to long-term projections, the housing demand will be on the decline, so we can further suppress the target. When are you going to provide the housing supply to meet the target? Well, this is a rolling 10-year housing supply target, and we conduct assessments and prepare target based on the supply and demand projections. In fact, according to figures, every year we're not able to meet the target, but it doesn't mean that we are staying put. We'll continue to work harder despite the difficulties. In fact, in this year's annual progress report, we explained at length strategies including increasing land supply and converting industrial buildings, and also 12,000 subsidized sale flats, and also a starter home project. The site will come on stream. All these strategies showed the government's hard work in expediting the public and private housing production. I urge members for your support, especially when we conduct local consultation and seek funding approval from LegCo. We hope members would give us some encouragement, because indeed the whole process takes years, from identifying the site to completing a project. Usually, it takes 7 or 8 years to go through all the steps at the earliest. Having compressed the timetable, because usually it takes on average 10 years. So please bear in mind that the problem cannot be tackled here and now, but we will do our level best. Right, Secretary, you mentioned that it cannot be resolved in a short term and increase supply to meet the target. But if we're still lagging behind the targets, what's the point of setting a target? Well, you mentioned your work. You mentioned how the timetable is compressed, but you haven't answered Mr. Wilson Orr's question. That is, whether it's possible to further compress the timetable and expedite the progress. You haven't even answered my question. Are you confident that you can stop the lag, and because Chinese New Year is coming soon and we will have another fortune reading? Please note his comment. Mr. Jeremy Tam will have a question, and then Deputy Chair Mr. Andrew Wan will have a follow-up question, and then I need to deal with these motions. I'm not going to ring the bell if we have a quorum. Mr. Jeremy Tam. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to pick up on the point made by Ms. Rebecca Chan about redeveloping aged housing estates. 3 years ago, when I first joined, I asked the then Secretary, Mr. Anthony Cheung, and I was not happy with his reply. His rationale was that because of shortage in supply, we cannot take down old buildings. There will be a problem with decanting affected residents. But this is really avoiding the problem, because it will pile up, and more public housing estates will age and become dilapidated and inhabitable. How are you going to defuse the bomb? Well, Mr. Frank Chan, just now you really adopted the same attitude. You said we need to assess the situation, whether newly completed estates should be allocated to new applicants or to existing residents affected by redevelopment. Now, Mrs. Carrie Lam at the moment is on the brink of stepping down. Is it because of this that you want to avert the risk and do as little as possible? Let's say if you take down an old housing estate, definitely the waiting time will get longer. But if you allow the problem to pile up, then the problem may exacerbate very quickly in the future. This is not optimal use of the land, and many aged housing estates could be inhabitable very soon. You have a clear idea how many housing estates are already 50 years of age. You should have a plan for redeveloping these sites. You can have a buffer of, say, 2 or 3 years, but at least you should have a plan. And you also have a land sharing pilot scheme. Well, of course, we don't know how many sites will actually come on stream. But be it brownfield sites or sites allowing for reclamation without causing major impact on the ecology, all these could allow increase in land supply. These are ways to tackle the problem. You cannot avoid redeveloping old public housing estates. Otherwise, you're just passing this time bomb to your successor. Secretary. Well, I think there's a misunderstanding here. Over the past 10 years, the Housing Authority already redeveloped 18 housing estates in phases. We have Tong Tau Estates, Phase 8, and Pak Tin Estates, Phases 7 and 11, etc., which will be redeveloped in the future. I want to explain that we need to do comprehensive assessment and investigation for old estates to explore the potential of additional residential units and also to address public housing supply shortage. Mr. Tam makes a very good point. Well, there is room for major redevelopment projects if land is available, so that we can revitalize public housing stock as well as meeting the needs of applicants on the waiting list. Right, Mr. Andrew Wan, Deputy Chair, will speak for the second round. I will give him 3 minutes because we need to deal with these motions. Just a point on figures. Many members ask questions on the projections. I know that the projections are prepared based on the CNSD's data, and I think we're all familiar with the methodology. Now, how you interpret these figures would affect the outcome. I made the point last time. I don't want to waste more time. Well, because of a shortage in supply, you are distorting the people's behavior. Anyway, my question is, the demand figure is 272,000 and is still 29,000 short. For the 5-year public housing production announced not long ago is 100,700. In other words, in the letter, well, according to your figures, in the second 5-year period, you will be able to complete 170,000 units. How are you able to achieve that? Do you play magic, or are you trying to forestall the matter so that many applicants will become ineligible? And then in the coming 3 or 4 years, there will be 93,000 units. I don't know why. If this is the trend, is it possible that in the coming 5 years that the figure could go up to beyond 100,000? So in the second half of the 10-year period, that means only 50,000 will be available. And what's the message for the private market? If you have mass market flats, the prices will go up. Is it that you're really trying to prop up the property market?
Indeed, if we are talking about lands already available, then if in the first 5 years we are doing 107,000, then the last 5 years would be 160,000. And so this is a calculation that is based on lands already available. And if site formation as well as progress of construction and also procedural clearances in the community are all fine, then we'll be able to meet this target. Of course, you may doubt this, but this year's and we'll see us coming to you another time to give you a latest update. As for private housing, indeed, in the coming 3 to 4 years, 93,000 flats will come on stream. And this figure is not plucked out of thin air. Actually, we've been using this figure for some time. And it doesn't mean that in the latter part of the 10-year period, the supply will be 20 to 30,000 flats only, because we still have to look at the prevailing private market situation before coming to a final decision as to exactly how much construction will that be. And so what I'm trying to say is that the private and public housing mix of 7 to 3 actually is adjustable depending on prevailing market condition. Okay, everybody has spoken, and we need to deal with 6 motions, and one of them being a revised motion. And according to our standing orders, we already have a quorum here. The first one is from Mr. Kwok Wai-keung and Mr. Ho Kai-ming. It's already being put on screen. Let's not read it out. Now, please vote by electronic means, because this particular motion is pertinent to our agenda item today, and so I clear it for being voted on. So if you are for it, please press your button. If you are in objection, please press your button, and the wording of the motion is already on screen. For, please press the relevant button, and if you are against, please also press the relevant button. Mr. Lo Wai-kok hasn't voted yet. Madam Regina Yip, I want to change my vote to abstention. Yes, you can still change it. I haven't announced the outcome yet.
Okay.
Mrs. Yip, have you pressed your button? Yes. The outcome of the vote is that 13 present, voted 13, and Mr. Kwok Wai-keung and Mr. Ho Kai-ming's joint motion is now being passed with 2 abstentions. Second motion from Mr. Fernando Zhang. He's not here, and so I'll deal with it when he comes into the chamber. Okay, so I'll put this on hold because this is a revised motion or amendment motion. Now, Mr. Kwok Wai-keung's motion is the third one that we're going to process. It's on screen now. Please proceed to a vote. Mr. Fernando Zhang, I'm sorry. I already called it. Sorry. Because we need to get the amendment motion out of the way before we can come to Mr. Kwok Wai-keung's motion. Mr. Kwok Wai-keung's motion? I'm sorry. I had no choice. I already called it. So Mr. Kwok Wai-keung and Mr. Ho Chi-ming's motion. I can't see the wording, it's too blurred. Is number 2. If you haven't voted, please vote now. So everyone has voted. I'll call the outcome. Vote is closed. Outcome, present, 15, for, 9, objection 4, abstention 1. And the motion is carried. Number 3 motion, once again from Mr. Kwok Wai-keung and Mr. Ho Kai-ming. Please look at number 3 on the screen. Once again, it is relevant to this panel's affairs, so I'll clear it for vote. I'm waiting for Mr. Choi-tik to come in. Please activate the voting system and please proceed to vote. This third motion is from Mr. Kwok Wai Keung and Mr. Ho Kai Ming as well. It's on screen. Everyone has voted. Who hasn't voted? Mr. Chu Hoi Dick has not voted. The vote is now closed. Present 16, for 15, objection 0, abstention 0. The motion is carried. Motion number 4 from Mr. Vincent Chang and Mr. Lau Kok Fun. Once again, is now on screen. Please look at the wording on screen. And we now proceed to a vote, and this is relevant to this panel's affairs. Please proceed to a vote. Number 4, Mr. Vincent Chang and Mr. Lau Kok Fun's motion. So have you all voted? The vote is now closed and the outcome is now called. Present 17, for 13, objection 0, abstention 3. This motion is carried. Finally, from Mr. Chu Hoi Dick's motion, because it is relevant to this panel's affairs, and that's why I clear it for a vote. Number 5 on the screen. Please proceed to a vote. Please activate the system. So this is a motion from Mr. Chu Hoi Dick. Everyone has voted? Right. The vote is closed. Present 16, for 5, objection 10. And this motion is defeated. So all of the motions have already been processed, and I have to apologize to Mr. Fernando Zhang because I already called that his motion would not be processed. Thank you very much for your attendance. The meeting is now adjourned.